When doctors surrendered and the world turned cold, Big Shaq stood at the edge of hopelessness, until the black beggar girl, from the forgotten streets, dared to speak the impossible. "Sir, I know how to make your son walk again," breathed a promise that no fortune could buy, no fame could summon. In a world where miracles are priced and power decides who gets saved, Big Shaq made a choice, and stepped into a war where love, faith and defiance would rewrite destiny itself. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Florida sun bathed everything in gold that day, as if the universe was mocking the O'Neill family with its cruel brightness. Children laughed in the distance, tires screeched on the blacktop, and the world spun forward without hesitation. Big Shaq, towering in both body and heart, stood with his wife Shawnee and their youngest boy Malik, a child of endless energy and crooked smiles. It was supposed to be a simple afternoon, a family gathering, a barbecue, a moment away from the flashing cameras and endless obligations that fame demanded. Shaq remembered tossing the football back and forth, laughing as Malik ran clumsily across the yard, his little legs faster than they had ever been. He remembered the sound first, that gut-wrenching, metallic thud, and then the silence that followed, thicker than any words. His head snapped toward the street in time to see a delivery van, stopped awkwardly at the curb, a crooked bicycle lying underneath. Malik's body didn't move, not an inch. Everything after that came in waves. Shawnee's screams ripping through the air, the pounding of his own feet against the asphalt, the sirens growing louder as the world shrank into a tunnel around him. Shaq held Malik's limp body against his chest, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep, feeling the boy's shallow breaths against his skin. He had never prayed harder in his life. At the hospital, time became a cruel master. Hours bled into hours. Doctors wearing sterile masks and colder expressions delivered the news as if reading from a script. Spinal trauma, permanent paralysis from the waist down. Prepare for a different future, different future. The words echoed in Shaq's mind like gunshots. He had always been the man who could lift anything, fix anything, protect everyone he loved. Now, staring at the sterile white sheets covering Malik's small body, he realized there were some weights even Big Shaq couldn't lift. Shawnee broke down first, crumpling into a chair like a puppet, whose strings had been cut. Shaq didn't cry, not then. His tears stayed locked behind an iron gate he had built long ago, a fortress of strength he thought his family needed. Instead, he kissed Malik's forehead and whispered the words only fathers understand. "I'm not giving up on you, son. I swear it." The media, ever hungry for the pain of the famous, swarmed the hospital in hours. Flashbulbs exploded outside. Rumors twisted their way through social media like vines. Shaq's son paralyzed. Tragic accident in Florida. Prayers for the O'Neill family. Every headline dug the knife a little deeper. Shaq despised them all. They didn't know Malik, the way his laughter could light up a room, the way he always offered Shaq the last cookie even though he wanted it himself. They only wanted a headline. Lucille O'Neill, Shaq's mother and the true matriarch of the family, arrived 2 days later. She walked straight past the cameras, straight past the security, and into that cold hospital room, where her son sat motionless beside Malik's bed. Without a word, she placed a hand on Shaq's shoulder, anchoring him to something deeper than pain, something unbreakable. "You're his miracle now," Lucille whispered, "and don't you ever forget it." The following weeks were a haze of physical therapists, specialists and second opinions. Shaq poured millions into every possible treatment. He bought the best doctors, flew to private clinics, consulted the top neurologists around the world. He wasn't Big Shaq anymore. He was just a father, desperate and drowning. And every single time the answer was the same, delivered with polite sorrow. "There's nothing more we can do." Malik, brave beyond his years, tried to put on a smile whenever his father visited. But Shaq saw through it. He saw the cracks in that little boy's armor, the way Malik stared at the kids playing outside his hospital window, the way he clenched his fists when he thought no one was looking. Hope was a fragile thing, and it was slipping away. Shaq would drive at night, alone in his truck, windows down, letting the humid Florida air slap him awake. He couldn't sleep anymore. His mind replayed the accident 1,000 ways. If only he had thrown the ball harder. If only he had looked up sooner. If only. Guilt gnawed at him with sharp teeth, and no amount of fame, money, or strength could silence it. One particular night, with Malik's quiet tears still fresh in his ears, Shaq found himself parked on the edge of a forgotten street, somewhere deep in the old quarter of the city. It was a place untouched by gentrification, where neon lights flickered over cracked sidewalks, and hope came in bottles and broken promises. He sat there, engine idling, heartbreaking, when he noticed a small figure crouched against a brick wall, wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket. She couldn't have been more than 15, maybe 16, but life had carved hard lines into her young face. Her skin gleamed dark against the pale streetlight, and her eyes, God, her eyes held a fierceness that belied her frail body. A cardboard sign leaned beside her, almost lost in the litter of the street. It read, "I heal broken things. Ask me how." Shaq might have driven on. Another lost soul in a city full of them. But something about her, some flicker of stubborn fire, made him pause. He stared, caught between cynicism and something dangerously close to hope. Then, slowly, the girl lifted her head and locked eyes with him. She didn't smile. She didn't beg. She simply rose to her feet with a grace that didn't belong to a child of the streets, dusted off her jeans, and crossed the distance between them, as if it were nothing at all. When she stopped beside his truck, she tilted her chin up defiantly and said 6 words that would change everything. "Sir, I know how to make your son walk again." Shaq blinked, stunned into silence. The city around them faded, the noise and chaos retreating like a tide, leaving only those words hanging heavy between them. Part of him wanted to laugh. Another scam artist preying on broken hearts. But another part, the part that had cradled Malik's tiny body and whispered promises against the darkness, couldn't turn away. He opened the passenger door without speaking. An invitation, a challenge. The girl climbed in without hesitation. The wheels of fate turned quietly as they drove away from that forgotten street, the city lights shrinking in the rearview mirror. Shaq didn't know it yet, but he had just invited a storm into his life. A storm that would tear open old wounds, expose hidden enemies, and demand more courage than he had ever thought possible. And somewhere, deep in his chest where hope had been buried beneath guilt and grief, a spark flickered back to life. Maybe miracles didn't come in white lab coats and clean hospital halls. Maybe, just maybe, they wore tattered jeans and carried cardboard signs. And maybe, just maybe, Big Shaq still had one fight left in him. The night breathed differently in the forgotten corners of the city, a slow, mournful sigh through crumbling alleys and flickering neon. Shaquille O'Neal walked these streets, not as the towering legend the world knew, but as a broken father searching for something no fame or fortune could deliver. He moved like a ghost, his massive frame wrapped in a hoodie too small to hide who he was, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a worn ball cap. He didn't care if people recognized him. In truth, he barely cared about anything anymore. The city buzzed around him, taxi horns blaring, drunken laughter spilling from doorways, the occasional bark of a street vendor hustling one last customer before midnight. It was a symphony of survival, and Shaq drifted through it unnoticed. Just another man swallowed by the noise. He had tried everything the bright, polished world had offered. Specialists, therapies, donations, hopes bought and sold like products on a shelf. But his son still lay motionless in a hospital bed, staring at ceilings too sterile to dream under. Shaq's steps slowed as he entered a part of the city the developers had forgotten. Here, the sidewalks cracked like broken promises, and graffiti clung to the bricks like old scars. There was a raw honesty to this place, a stripped-down reality that made the glittering world of fame seem even more hollow. Here, people didn't pretend. They fought, they begged, they survived, and sometimes, if they were lucky, they whispered secrets to those desperate enough to listen. He paused at a corner where the streetlights stuttered uncertainly, casting long, shifting shadows across the pavement. It was there that he saw her again, the beggar girl with the fierce, ancient eyes. She sat cross-legged against the wall, her frame impossibly small against the sprawling city. In her lap, a tattered book lay open, its pages fluttering in the evening breeze. She wasn't begging tonight. She wasn't even looking at the pedestrians who stepped over her like trash. Instead, she was staring straight at Shaq, as if she had been waiting. For a heartbeat, he considered walking past. Logic screamed at him. This was madness. What could a girl who lived in the gutters know about healing spinal cords and shattered dreams? Yet something heavier, something deeper rooted, in that place inside him that still dared to hope, made his feet stay planted. Without realizing it, Shaq found himself moving closer. The girl's eyes didn't waver, didn't blink. They pinned him in place, reading every scar carved into his heart. She closed the book carefully, rising to her feet with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who knew every movement mattered. Her clothes hung off her frame, jeans torn at the knees, a jacket 2 sizes too big, but her presence was undeniable, her gaze steady as a surgeon's hand. "You came back," she said simply. Shaq's throat tightened. He hadn't come back for her. He hadn't come back for anything. And yet here he was standing under a dying streetlight, with a stranger who spoke to him like an old friend. "I didn't know I was looking for you," he managed, voice low and rough. "You were," she said with a certainty that made him shiver despite the humid air. "People like you always come looking when the pretty answers stop working." Shaq studied her, the way the muscles in her jaw clenched and released, the way her fingers traced absent circles against the worn fabric of her jeans. There was an urgency in her, a crackling tension just beneath the surface. She wasn't selling false hope. She was carrying something heavier, something real. "You said you could help my son," he said, hating how desperate he sounded. The girl nodded. "I can't." A city bus rumbled by, momentarily drowning out everything. Shaq watched her in the flickering shadows, the world around them blurring into meaningless noise. When the bus passed, she was still there, unflinching. "How?" he demanded, sharper than he meant to. Instead of answering, she knelt and pulled a piece of chalk from her pocket, white against her dark fingers. With quick, sure strokes, she began drawing on the cracked sidewalk, intricate lines and symbols Shaq didn't recognize, weaving together like a tapestry. She worked fast, eyes darting up and down the street between movements, as if wary of being seen. When she finished, she stood back and gestured. "This is how energy moves through the body. Most doctors, they only treat the symptoms. They don't listen to the body's real voice. I can hear it. I can fix what they can't." Shaq stared at the messy chalk diagram, skepticism battling with something far more dangerous, hope. He thought of Malik's face, brave and broken. He thought of every doctor who had shrugged, every therapist who had looked away. "Who are you?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. The girl smiled for the first time. Not a sweet smile, but a bitter, knowing one. "No one you'd believe if I told you. Just know this. The world you live in wasn't built for people like me to be seen. But that doesn't mean we're powerless." She scuffed the chalk drawing with her boot until it vanished into dust. "You'll have to trust me," she said. "Or not. But either way, your son's running out of time." Shaq didn't know whether it was the desperation eating him alive or the undeniable conviction in her voice. But the decision crystallized inside him, sharp and irreversible. He nodded once. The girl seemed to relax slightly, though her body remained coiled, ready for betrayal. She motioned for him to follow her down a narrow alleyway lit only by the glow of a flickering neon sign. As they walked, Shaq noticed how the crowds thinned, how the world grew quieter, more dangerous. He wasn't afraid. He had faced worse opponents on the court and in life. But this felt different. This wasn't a fight he could win with strength. At the end of the alley stood an abandoned building, its windows boarded, its doors chained. The girl knelt by the rusted padlock, whispering under her breath. Shaq thought he heard his name woven into whatever words she spoke, but it was gone before he could be sure. With a soft click, the lock popped open. She pushed the door inward and stepped into the darkness without hesitation. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the ghost of old dreams. Broken furniture littered the floor, and graffiti screamed from the walls. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single shaft of moonlight, stood a battered medical table, surrounded by strange instruments, things Shaq couldn't name but recognized as tools of healing. "This is where it has to happen," she said. "Hospitals are too sterile, too controlled. The energy can't move right there." Shaq swallowed hard. It felt insane. It was insane. But standing in that broken room with this broken girl, he realized he had already crossed the threshold. There was no turning back. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Faith," she answered. And silence. She pulled a worn satchel from beneath the table, her hands steady as she laid out small vials, herbal mixtures, ancient-looking metal tools that hummed faintly when touched. Shaq watched, the enormity of what he was doing pressing against his ribs, until breathing felt like a battle. "Tomorrow," she said, without looking up. "Bring him here. Early. Before the city wakes." He hesitated. "And if this doesn't work?" The girl looked up then, her eyes burning with something fierce and eternal. "Then at least you'll know you fought with everything you had," she said. "Most fathers never do." Her words sliced clean through him. Shaq nodded again, a soldier accepting his orders, even if he didn't understand the war. He turned to leave, the night swallowing him whole. Behind him, the girl knelt once more, drawing invisible symbols into the dusty floor, her voice a whisper lost to the dark. The streets buzzed and churned as Shaq emerged back into the city. But something had changed. The rhythm had shifted. Somewhere in the heartbeat of the alleys, and the breath of the crumbling buildings, fate had stirred, and it was no longer sleeping. Shaq pulled his hoodie tighter around his broad shoulders and disappeared into the night, carrying with him a hope so fragile it could shatter at any wrong step, but alive nonetheless. Tomorrow would come. And with it, the first true fight for Malik's future. The morning crawled into existence, stubborn and reluctant, casting a sickly gray light over the sleeping city. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the hospital window, arms crossed against his chest, watching the sun struggle to break through the dense clouds. He hadn't slept, could. Malik's small form lay motionless behind him, machines humming their cruel lullabies, as if mocking the life that should have been thriving inside that fragile body. Shaq's mind played the girl's words over and over again, like a broken record. "Sir, I know how to make your son walk again." He had never been a man easily swayed by wild claims or desperate hopes. He had built a life on hard work, discipline, and clear-eyed realism. Yet something about that girl, the fire in her voice, the unshakable certainty in her eyes, had clawed through the thick armor he wore against the world. He turned from the window, his massive frame casting a shadow over the hospital room. Malik's eyes fluttered open, dull and tired. A small smile flickered across his face when he saw his father, but it didn't reach his eye. "Morning, Dad," Malik whispered, voice barely audible. Shaq swallowed hard and forced a smile. "Morning, champ." He pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, feeling the weight of decisions he wasn't sure he had the right to make. How could he gamble what little Malik had left on a stranger's promise, whispered in a crumbling alleyway? How could he? As he sat there, the door creaked open, and Shawnee slipped into the room. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her smile brittle. She placed a gentle hand on Shaq's shoulder before leaning down to kiss Malik's forehead. "I brought you some breakfast," she said softly, holding up a paper bag that smelled faintly of pancakes and syrup. Malik shook his head. "Not hungry." Shawnee's face tightened, but she didn't argue. She set the bag down and sat on the other side of the bed, one hand clutching Malik's limp fingers. The three of them sat in heavy silence, each lost in their own private grief. Shaq's mind churned. He thought about the doctors and their pitying looks, about the therapists who spoke in careful, measured tones, as if Malik were already half a memory, about the empty prayers whispered by people who barely knew them, seeking comfort more for themselves than for the broken boy lying between them. And then he thought about her, the girl with the storm in her eyes, and the world's secrets etched into her palms. He stood suddenly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Shawnee looked up, startled. "Where are you going?" she asked. Shaq hesitated, the words bitter on his tongue. I have to try something." Shawnee's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about, Shaquille? What are you trying?" He couldn't tell her. Not yet. She wouldn't understand. Maybe he didn't even understand it himself. All he knew was that the hollow ache inside him had shifted, filled with a restless urgency he couldn't ignore. "Trust me," he said quietly. "Please." Shawnee's face crumpled, fear warring with love. Finally, she nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. Shaq leaned down and kissed Malik's forehead. "Be ready, champ. We're going on a little trip." Malik blinked up at him, confusion flickering across his face, but he nodded without question. Trust, blind and absolute. 2 hours later, Shaq carried Malik carefully to the truck, cradling him against his chest like he had when he was just a baby. Shawnee followed, her face pale and strained. The nurses tried to protest, but the weight of Shaq's reputation and his steely glare silenced them. The city unfolded around them as they drove, the skyline jagged against the bruised morning sky. Malik dozed in the passenger seat, head resting against the window. Shaq drove on autopilot, his massive hands gripping the steering wheel, until his knuckles whitened. He found the alley without thinking, his instincts guiding him through the maze of forgotten streets. As he pulled up to the crumbling building, he saw her standing there, waiting. The girl was dressed the same, tattered jeans, oversized jacket. But today there was something different in the way she held herself. A gravity, a purpose. Shaq cut the engine and sat for a moment, staring at her. Doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Was he insane? Trusting a homeless girl with his son's life? What if this was a scam? What if it was worse? The girl moved first, stepping forward with slow, deliberate steps. She stopped beside the truck and looked up at him, her gaze steady. "You came," she said simply. Shaq nodded, unable to find his voice. "Good," she said. "We don't have much time." He got out and gently lifted Malik from the seat. The boy stirred, blinking blearily at the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where are we, Dad?" Malik mumbled. "Somewhere special," Shaq said, forcing a confidence he didn't feel. The girl led them into the building, the door groaning on rusted hinges. Inside, the space was much as Shaq remembered. Dusty, broken, forgotten. But in the center, the battered medical table gleamed under a shaft of sunlight that pierced the grime-streaked window. Shaq laid Malik carefully on the table, heart hammering in his chest. The girl moved around them with a strange efficiency, lighting candles, arranging vials, humming under her breath. The air filled with the sharp, clean scent of herbs, and something older, something deeper. She placed a hand gently on Malik's chest, closing her eyes. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the boy's shallow breaths and the soft crackle of candle flames. Then she spoke, her voice low and rhythmic, weaving words Shaq didn't understand, but felt deep in his bones. Malik stirred, a soft whimper escaping his lips, but the girl didn't stop. Her hands moved in intricate patterns above his body, tracing invisible lines of force. Shaq watched, torn between awe and terror. Was this real? Was it madness? He didn't know anymore. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Sweat beaded on the girl's forehead, her body trembling with effort. Malik's breathing grew erratic, his face contorting in pain. "What's happening?" Shaq demanded, panic rising. "His body is fighting," the girl said through gritted teeth. "It's waking up." Malik cried out, his back arching slightly off the table. Shaq moved instinctively to grab him, to stop the pain, but the girl shouted sharply, "Don't touch him. Trust the process." Shaq froze, torn apart inside. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to protect his son. But he stayed rooted, fists clenched at his sides. Malik's cries grew louder, then choked into gasping sobs. Shaq felt tears burning his own eyes, powerless in the face of his son's pain. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Malik slumped back against the table, chest heaving, sweat-soaked hair clinging to his forehead. The girl collapsed to her knees, trembling with exhaustion. Shaq rushed to Malik's side, gathering the boy into his arms. "Malik, Malik, talk to me." Malik stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. His gaze locked onto Shaq's, and for the first time in weeks, there was light there, weak, flickering, but real.
"Dad," Malik whispered. "I felt something. My legs. I felt them."
Shaq choked on a sob, crushing Malik against his chest. Relief and disbelief warred inside him, leaving him shaking. The girl dragged herself upright, leaning heavily against the table. She wiped the sweat from her brow and met Shaq's gaze. "This is only the beginning," she said hoarsely. "He'll need more sessions. It's not a miracle. It's work. Hard work." Shaq nodded, words failing him. "Who are you?" he asked again, voice rough with emotion. The girl smiled, tired and triumphant. "Someone who knows what it's like to be broken," she said, "and what it takes to heal." As Shaq carried Malik back to the truck, the city around them buzzed on, blind and indifferent. But inside Shaq, a spark had caught fire, fierce, unyielding, hope, reborn. Shaq leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. It painted a brutal, heartbreaking picture. A girl born with a mind sharp enough to reshape the world, crushed under the heel of a system built to ignore her. A girl who should have been a surgeon, a healer, but was instead forced to wield her brilliance in the shadows, invisible to those who needed her most. He ended the call without another word, his heart a battlefield of rage and sorrow. Later that evening, he returned to the crumbling building where it had all begun. The girl, Layla, was already there, perched on the edge of the medical table, sharpening a crude scalpel with the calm focus of a master craftsman. "You had me checked out," she said without looking up. Shaq didn't deny it. "Had to." "You find what you were looking for?" she asked, a ghost of a smile tugging at her mouth. "I found a kid who should be running hospitals," Shaq said, "not running from them." Lila's hands stilled. She set the scalpel down carefully, and finally met his gaze. For the first time, Shaq saw the crack in her armor, a flicker of vulnerability she usually kept locked away. "They never wanted me," she said quietly. "Doesn't matter how smart you are when you look like me. When you come from where I come from, you're just another problem to be managed." Shaq moved closer, every instinct in him bristling with a rage he hadn't realized he still carried. Not just for Malik, not just for his own battles, but for every child crushed under the weight of a world too blind to see their worth. "You're not a problem," he said, voice low. "You're the answer." Layla laughed, a brittle sound. "Tell that to the cops who chased me off for fixing a guy's broken leg. Tell that to the doctors who call security when I walk into their lobbies." Shaq sat down heavily on a nearby crate, his broad shoulders sagging. "You don't trust me," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't trust anybody," Layla said. "Trust is what gets you killed." Shaq nodded slowly. He couldn't blame her. Trust in her world was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Then don't trust me," he said finally. "Trust Malik. He deserves a chance. You deserve a chance." Layla studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching for the lie, the trap, the inevitable betrayal. Whatever she saw, or didn't see, seemed to satisfy her, because she leaned back, exhaling sharply. "Fine," she said. "But understand something, Shaq. This isn't just about muscles and nerves. His spirit's broken too. If we don't fix both, he'll never walk again." Shaq's throat tightened. He knew she was right. He had seen it in Malik's eyes, the slow erosion of hope, the creeping belief that he was less, that he was lost. "We'll fix it," Shaq promised. "Together." For the first time, Layla smiled. A real smile. Small and fragile but real. It was a start. They worked late into the night, planning the next phase of Malik's therapy. Layla explained the process in careful detail, using words and concepts that made Shaq's head spin. She talked about energy pathways, neural remapping, techniques she had pieced together from stolen textbooks, overheard lectures, and desperate trial and error on the streets. It was medicine, yes, but something more, something deeper. A healing of both flesh and soul. As the candles burned lower and the stars wheeled overhead, Shaq realized something he hadn't dared to hope for. He wasn't just fighting for Malik's future anymore. He was fighting for Layla's too. Because somewhere behind her fierce, guarded eyes was a storm waiting to break. Not a storm of destruction, but of change, of healing, of hope. And for the first time in a long, long while, Shaq wasn't afraid of the storm. He was ready to walk through it. "Perfect. Following your clear instructions." The sun was barely a thought on the horizon when Shaq parked the truck in front of the crumbling building once again. The city still cloaked in the heavy silence of pre-dawn. Inside the cab, Malik stirred, his face pale but determined. He hadn't asked many questions after the last session, only clung to the faint hope that anything could stir life back into his sleeping legs. Shaq, on the other hand, felt like every nerve in his body was wound so tight that even breathing felt dangerous. The sun was barely a thought on the horizon when Shaq parked the truck in front of the crumbling building once again, the city still cloaked in the heavy silence of pre-dawn. Inside the cab, Malik stirred, his face pale but determined. He hadn't asked many questions after the last session, only clung to the faint hope that anything could stir life back into his sleeping legs. Shaq, on the other hand, felt like every nerve in his body was wound so tight that even breathing felt dangerous. He cut the engine and sat still for a moment, his large hands clenched on the steering wheel, staring through the cracked windshield at the boarded-up door. Doubt gnawed at him, louder now, fueled by a lifetime of caution and the haunting fear that trusting a girl from the streets with his son's future was madness. Every instinct demanded he turn back, go find another doctor, another hospital, another proper solution. But then Malik's hand found his, small and trembling. "I'm ready, Dad," Malik whispered. Shaq turned, meeting his son's eyes, so full of fear, so full of stubborn, fragile hope, and he felt something inside himself settle. Not vanish, not surrender, just settle. He nodded, squeezing Malik's hand before lifting him carefully into his arms. Layla was already waiting inside, her lean figure lit by the soft, flickering glow of candles set around the battered medical table. She moved with the kind of nervous energy that betrayed the weight of what was about to happen. But when she turned and saw them, her face hardened with resolve. Shaq laid Malik down gently on the table, stepping back as Layla approached, her satchel slung over one thin shoulder. She unpacked her tools with precise, deliberate movements, strange vials, bundles of dried herbs, and small instruments that looked more ancient than medical.
You sure about this?
Shaq asked, his voice low and rough. Layla didn't look up. No. But if we wait until we're sure, he'll never walk again. Shaq swallowed hard. Logic fought with instinct inside him. A brutal tug of war between a father's duty to protect and a man's desperate need to believe. Finally, he nodded. Let's do it, he said. Layla worked quickly, wiping Malik's legs down with a pungent-smelling liquid that made the boy flinch. She murmured words under her breath. Not spells, not magic, but something older, more primal. A connection to the body that Western medicine had long forgotten. Shaq stood rooted to the spot, heart hammering, every muscle screaming to intervene as Malik whimpered softly. Talk to him, Layla instructed sharply. Keep him here. Shaq pulled a stool closer, taking Malik's small hand in both of his. He leaned in, his voice deep and steady. Remember that time we built that treehouse, champ, he said. You fell out of that first branch like 3 times, but you wouldn't give up. You kept climbing. You made me climb too. Thought I was gonna crack my head open trying to fit into that tree. Malik gave a breathy, weak chuckle. That's the fight I need from you now, Shaq said. That climb. Right here. Right now. Malik nodded faintly, his fingers tightening slightly around Shaq's hand. Layla placed strange, cool metal nodes along Malik's spine, then along his legs. She tapped each one lightly, whispering, creating a network that Shaq didn't pretend to understand. She took a final deep breath, then pressed her palms firmly against Malik's temples. The first jolt was so small that Shaq almost missed it. A twitch of Malik's left foot, no bigger than the flutter of a leaf. But it was real. It was there. Shaq gasped aloud, his heart lurching into his throat. Malik's eyes flew open, wild with fear and wonder. I felt that, Malik cried. Layla's face remained a mask of fierce concentration, sweat breaking out across her forehead. She moved her hands lower, whispering faster now, tracing invisible lines along Malik's body. The air around them seemed to hum, thick with something Shaq couldn't name. Another twitched stronger this time. Malik's leg jerked slightly, his heel dragging an inch across the table. Shaq felt tears burning the back of his eyes, but he forced them down. Not yet. Not yet. But then, just as hope surged, Malik cried out, a sharp, pained sound that echoed off the crumbling walls. Layla snapped her hands away, breathing hard. Malik sagged back against the table, his face pale and slick with sweat. No, Shaq bellowed, stepping forward, but Layla threw up a hand to stop him. Don't, she rasped. Give him a second. His nerves are confused. It's like waking up after being asleep too long. Shaq hovered, fists clenched at his sides, every fiber of his being screaming to scoop Malik up and run far away from this madness. But then Malik stirred, blinking up at them.
It hurts, he whimpered.
I know, baby, Shaq said, his voice cracking. Layla wiped her forehead with the sleeve of her jacket. She looked exhausted, barely able to stand, but her eyes burned with fierce determination. This is the first wall, she said. We have to break through it. Slowly, or we'll cause more harm. Shaq nodded tightly, though every inch of him rebelled against it. He sat back down, his hand never leaving Malik's. For the next hour, they pushed and pulled at the threshold of pain and possibility. Layla coaxed small movements from Malik's legs, a flex of the toes, a spasm in the calf, a trembling lift of the heel. Every success was hard-won, every failure a brutal punch to the gut. There were moments when Shaq almost pulled the plug, almost said enough, but every time he looked into Malik's wide, desperate eyes, he found the strength to stay still. By the time Layla finally stepped back, swaying with exhaustion, the candle flames had burned low, casting long, eerie shadows against the graffiti-smeared walls. It's a start, she said hoarsely. Tomorrow we do more. Shaq rose on unsteady legs, scooping Malik carefully into his arms. The boy clung to him, trembling but alive, more alive than he had been since the accident. As Shaq carried him toward the door, he paused, turning back to Layla. Why are you doing this? He asked. Really? Layla wiped her hands on her jeans, her face unreadable. Because when I was 10, my mama fell down some stairs. Broke her back. They sent her home with a bottle of painkillers and a death sentence, because she couldn't pay for better. I sat by her bed for 2 years, watching her waste away, wishing anyone would come help us. She met Shaq's gaze without flinching. No one came. So I decided if I ever figured out how to help someone else's mama, Someone else's son. I would. Shaq's throat closed tight. He wanted to say something. Anything. But the weight of her words crushed the air from his lungs. He just nodded. Outside, the city had begun to stir, the early risers blinking into the gray dawn. Shaq slid into the driver's seat. Malik nestled carefully in the passenger side, his head resting against the window. As they drove away from the battered building, Malik spoke, his voice slurred with exhaustion, but full of something that made Shaq's heart ache. "She's gonna fix me, Dad," Malik said. "I know it." Shaq reached over and squeezed his son's hand. "Yeah, champ," he said softly. "She's gonna fix you." But deep down, Shaq knew it wasn't just Malik who was being healed. It was all of them. Every broken piece, every old wound, every quiet prayer that had gone unanswered for too long. It was just the beginning. Understood. Moving forward exactly as you instructed. For a few days, Shaq allowed himself the luxury of believing the worst was behind them. Malik was moving more small, clumsy movements at first, but undeniably real. His spirit was rekindling, his eyes brighter, his laughter slowly returning. Even Shani, though cautious, couldn't deny the spark of life returning to their son. Every day they slipped back to the broken building before dawn, letting Lila work her strange, stubborn magic. Every day Malik grew stronger. Hope, once a bitter memory, now tasted sweet again. But nothing in Shaq's life had ever stayed untouched for long. It started with a nurse at the hospital, a woman with bright teeth and careful smiles, the kind of woman who knew how to weaponize politeness. She reported concerns to the administration. Shaq had been removing Malik from scheduled therapy sessions. His rehabilitation plan had been compromised. He was, in her carefully chosen words, endangering the child's long-term health. From there, the whispers grew into a roar. First, there was a call from the hospital board. Crisp clinical voices inviting Shaq to a discussion about Malik's care. Shaq attended, jaw clenched, heart hammering against his ribs. He sat in a sterile boardroom, the long glass table reflecting the gleam of expensive watches and perfectly manicured hands. Across from him sat a panel of doctors, lawyers, and executives. All of them white, all of them smiling that same tight, condescending smile. Dr. Preston, head of pediatric neurology, cleared his throat and began, "Mr. O'Neill, first let us say, we have the utmost respect for you, your family, and your son's journey. We understand how traumatic this must be." Shaq said nothing. He knew that tone. It was the sound of someone sharpening a knife with velvet gloves. However, Preston continued, shuffling a few papers for dramatic effect. "There have been troubling reports concerning your decision to remove Malik from approved medical treatments in favor of less conventional methods." Shaq's fists tightened on his knees. "Alternative therapies are legal," he said evenly, "as long as they don't endanger the patient." A woman in a tailored navy suit, her hair pulled so tight it looked painful, leaned forward. "And yet," she said, voice dripping with artificial concern, "you've entrusted your son's recovery to an unlicensed individual. Someone with no medical training, no formal education, no legal certification, a homeless minor with a history of criminal behavior." The air in the room thickened. Shaq could feel the rage burning under his skin, but he forced it down, forced himself to stay still. "Layla Brooks," the woman continued, flipping through a thin, damning file. "Arrested for trespassing, theft, and unauthorized practice of medicine. A danger not only to herself, but to others." Shaq leaned forward slowly, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the table. "You ever actually talk to her?" he asked quietly. Preston cleared his throat again, shifting uncomfortably. "Mr. O'Neill, this isn't personal. It's about ensuring Malik receives the best care by qualified professionals." Shaq laughed, low and humorless. "Qualified professionals who told me my son would never walk again?" he said. "Qualified professionals who gave up before they even tried." A ripple of discomfort passed through the board. They didn't like being challenged, especially not by a black man who refused to bow to their authority. The woman in the navy suit straightened her papers, her smile freezing into something colder. "We are prepared to escalate this issue legally, if necessary," she said. "Malik's well-being is our top priority. If we must, we will pursue court intervention to secure appropriate medical guardianship." The threat hung heavy in the air. Shaq rose slowly to his feet, towering over them, his voice a deep rumble of controlled fury. "You come for my son," he said. "You better bring more than your words." Without waiting for a dismissal, he turned and walked out, the heavy doors swinging shut behind him. Outside, the Florida sun was blinding, the heat pressing down like a weight. Shaq stood on the steps of the hospital, breathing hard, the knot of rage in his chest tightening with every beat. He wasn't stupid. He knew what was happening. They weren't attacking him because they cared about Malik. They were attacking him because he had dared to step outside their carefully controlled system, because he had put his trust in someone who didn't fit their mold. A black girl from the streets, brilliant and dangerous in ways they refused to acknowledge. To them, Layla wasn't a healer. She was a threat, an unapproved miracle. The media caught wind of it within days. Headlines exploded across social media and tabloids alike. Shaq endangers son's health with unlicensed therapy. NBA legend's reckless gamble. Street girl versus science. Where are child services? Concern grows for Malik O'Neal. Every photo was carefully chosen. Shaq looking angry. Malik looking frail. Layla looking wild-eyed and dangerous. The narrative was crafted perfectly, each word a blade slicing at Shaq's credibility. Reporters camped outside his home. Talk shows debated his fitness as a father. Armchair critics flooded his social media with venom. Some called him brave. Most called him reckless. A few were blunter, dragging race into the open with comments too ugly to repeat, accusing Shaq of betraying his own success by stooping to street trash. Through it all, Shaq refused to back down. He tightened security around the house. He moved Malik's sessions with Layla to different locations, never staying in one spot too long. He met with lawyers, crafting ironclad defenses against any legal action. He sat down with Malik every night, holding his hand, whispering the same promise over and over again. I got you, champ. No matter what. But the pressure was relentless. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of headlines and threats, Shawnee cornered him in the kitchen. Her face was pale, drawn tight with fear. Shaq, we can't fight everyone, she said, her voice trembling. They're coming after us. After Malik, Shaq turned from the window, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. I know, he said. Shawnee's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter. I'm scared, she whispered. Shaq crossed the room in 2 steps, pulling her into his arms. She sobbed against his chest, and he held her, feeling the weight of the world pressing down harder than ever. I am too, he admitted. But we don't get to quit. Later that night, Shaq sat alone in his study, staring at a photo of Malik, as a toddler. Wide grin, chubby fists, fearless eyes. He thought about everything they had fought for, everything they still had to lose. And then he thought about Layla, fierce, brilliant, broken, and unbowed. He thought about the polished faces sitting behind that glass table, speaking poison with smiles. And he made a decision. They would not win. Not this time. The next morning, Shaq called a press conference. Not at a hotel, not at a sponsor's venue, but right there in the battered neighborhood where Layla had found him. Reporters gathered like vultures, their cameras trained on the graffiti-smeared walls and cracked sidewalks, the perfect background for a scandal. Shaq stepped up to the microphone, his towering presence impossible to ignore. My name is Shaquille O'Neal, he said, and I'm here today not to defend myself, because I don't need defending, but to speak the truth. The crowd murmured, cameras clicking frantically. My son, Malik, was told he would never walk again. By the best doctors, by the best hospitals, by the same system that's now telling you I'm wrong for trying something different, something outside their comfort zone. He paused, letting the words sink in. I trusted someone they don't want you to see, he said. A young woman named Layla Brooks. A girl who's been fighting her whole life against a system designed to ignore her. She's not licensed. She's not rich. But she's brilliant. And she's saving my son. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. I'm not ashamed of that, Shaq said, voice rising. I'm proud. Proud that when the world told me to give up, I found someone who said, let's fight. He stepped back from the mic, letting the silence roar louder than any words. For a moment, the reporters didn't know how to react. Then, slowly, the questions started, the noise rising again. Shaq turned and walked away, Malik's picture still clutched in his massive hand. He knew the war was far from over, but he also knew this. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand in the light and refuse to back down. For a moment it seemed the storm was finally beginning to pass. Malik's strength grew day by day, his small victories stacking up like stones, paving a new future. He could wiggle his toes now without effort, flex his ankles, even lift his legs slightly off the bed under his own power. It wasn't walking, not yet, but it was closer than the doctors had ever dared to promise. Shaq found himself smiling more, laughing more, daring to imagine a day when his son would run across a basketball court, his laughter echoing into the rafters. And through it all, Layla remained a constant quiet, focused, relentless. Her sessions were brutal, but brilliant, each one pushing Malik further toward the impossible. There was something sacred about those mornings in the battered building, the way the candles flickered against the cracked walls, the way Malik's face lit up after every small triumph. It felt like they were building a miracle with their own hands. But miracles, Shaq knew, made people uneasy, especially the kind of people who had built their lives around the belief that miracles belonged only to those who could afford them. The betrayal came from someone Shaq never expected. Trey Lewis had been one of Shaq's closest friends for years. They'd come up together in the league, fought the same battles against media scrutiny, shared late-night talks about dreams and fears. Trey was Malik's godfather, had been there at the hospital the night of the accident, had promised through gritted teeth to help Shaq get Malik anything he needed. Trey had sat in Shaq's living room, holding a beer in one hand and Shaq's grief in the other, swearing loyalty that ran deeper than blood. So when Trey started asking questions, Shaq didn't think much of it at first. "You really trust this girl, man?" Trey asked one evening, tossing a basketball between his hands. His voice casual, too casual. Shaq, sitting across the room, shrugged. "Trust her with my son's life." Trey whistled low, shaking his head. "That's a lot to put on some street rat with no diploma." Shaq stiffened, the old rage bubbling under the surface. "Don't call her that." Trey held up his hands in mock surrender. "Just saying, bro. You're betting everything on a kid who don't even have a roof over her head." Shaq forced a laugh, trying to shake it off. "Maybe that's why I trust her. She ain't got nothing to lose." Trey smiled then, but it didn't reach his eyes. Shaq, distracted by Malik's progress, missed the warning signs, the flicker of envy, the bitterness curling around Trey's words like smoke. It wasn't until the first sabotage that Shaq realized something was wrong. One morning, after another brutal but successful therapy session, Malik fell violently ill. Vomiting, sweating, his body trembling with fever. Panic tore through Shaq as he rushed Malik to the hospital, Lila pacing anxiously outside the emergency room, wringing her hands. The doctors diagnosed it as poisoning. Trace amounts of a toxic herb, mixed into Malik's nutritional supplements. Nothing lethal, nothing that would kill him. Just enough to weaken him, to break his progress, to make Shaq question everything. At first, suspicion fell naturally on Lila. The hospital board seized the opportunity, crowing about the dangers of unsanctioned healers, demanding immediate intervention. Reporters lined up like vultures, ready to spin the tragedy into headlines dripping with righteous condemnation. But Shaq knew better. He watched Layla, saw the terror in her eyes, the way she refused to leave Malik's side even when the doctors glared at her like a criminal. He saw how she refused food, refused sleep, working tirelessly to help Malik purge the toxins from his body. No, she would never hurt Malik, not after everything. And then Shaq remembered the supplements. Special mixes prepared for Malik's weakened immune system. Ordered through a trusted supplier, a connection Shaq hadn't questioned because he came through Trey. Dread curdled in Shaq's gut. The next day, under the guise of friendly conversation, Shaq confronted Trey. "Funny thing about those supplements," Shaq said, keeping his voice light. "Hospital ran tests, found contaminants." Trey stiffened. "Just a fraction, but it was enough." "Cheap suppliers," Trey said, shrugging. "You know how it is." Shaq smiled, slow and cold. "Yeah," he said. "I know exactly how it is." Trey's mask slipped then, bitterness twisting his features. "You were supposed to move on, man," Trey snapped. "Not throw everything away for some dirty little witch doctor. You're Shaq. You don't need to slum it with strays to fix your damn kid." The words hit like a slap, sharper than any physical blow. Shaq saw the truth then, saw the poison not just in Malik's blood, but in Trey's heart. The envy, the racism, dressed up in jokes and backhanded advice. The fear that Shaq, by trusting someone like Lila, was threatening the neat, polished world they were supposed to protect. "You tried to sabotage my son's recovery," Shaq said quietly, his voice trembling with fury. "You put him in danger." Trey scoffed. "I saved you. You just too blind to see it." Shaq stepped forward, towering over his former friend, every muscle taut with barely restrained fury. "You're done," he said. "Get out of my life. You ever come near Malik again, near Lila again, you'll regret it." He turned away, heart pounding, the finality of it echoing inside him. Trey didn't follow. He didn't need to. The damage was done. That night, Shaq sat with Layla in the abandoned building, watching Malik sleep peacefully on the battered table. The candles flickered, casting their faces in gold and shadow. He did it because of me, Layla said quietly, staring at the floor. Because I'm not the right kind of healer. Shaq reached out, placing a massive hand gently on her narrow shoulder. He did it because he's small, Shaq said. You're not. Layla looked up, tears glinting in her fierce eyes. They're never gonna stop coming for us, she whispered. People like me. Shaq nodded, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on them both. Then we keep fighting, he said, one step at a time. Layla smiled then, a small, broken, beautiful thing. And for the first time, Shaq believed they could win. Not because miracles fell from the sky, but because sometimes the greatest miracles grew out of the ugliest soil, fierce, stubborn, and unwilling to bow. And if betrayal had taught him anything, it was this. They were stronger than anyone knew. Do it again, Layla whispered, her voice trembling. Malik clenched his jaw, beads of sweat popping along his brow. He focused every ounce of his will downward, face contorted with effort, and the toes moved. It was nothing grand, no miracle leap, no triumphant stride, just a slight shaky curl of Malik's toes against the thin blanket. But to Shaq, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Tears blurred his vision as he stumbled to the table, dropping to his knees beside it. You did it, champ, he choked out. You did it. Malik turned his head slowly, his eyes wide with shock and wonder. I felt it, he gasped. I moved it, Dad. I really moved it. Layla sagged against the table, her hands trembling as she covered her mouth to stifle a sob. Shaq reached out blindly, pulling both Malik and Layla into a crushing embrace, their tears mingling in the dim candlelight. For a moment, time stood still. But victory, as Shaq was learning, was never without cost. The days that followed were a brutal test of endurance. Malik's muscles, dormant for too long, rebelled against being woken. Cramps racked his legs, spasms left him gasping in pain. Layla adjusted her therapy methods daily, balancing the need to push against the risk of causing permanent damage. It was a tightrope walk with no safety net. Some days Malik made progress, lifting a foot higher, holding a twitch longer. Other days his body betrayed him, refusing to respond no matter how desperately he fought. Those days were the hardest. The days when Malik sobbed into his pillow begging to quit. When Shawnee clung to Shaq in the kitchen whispering that maybe they had made a terrible mistake. Shaq carried the weight of it all. A silent, relentless burden that bent his back and hollowed his eyes. But he never let Malik see the cracks. Never let the boy believe he was alone in the fight. You fall, Shaq said one night, kneeling beside Malik's bed. You get back up. That's the rule. That's the only rule that matters. Malik nodded through his tears, clutching Shaq's hand like a lifeline. The bond between father and son grew stronger with each battle. So did the bond between Shaq and Layla. They learned to read each other's silences, to anchor each other when the storms grew too fierce. Layla, once so guarded, now let Shaq see glimpses of the girl she had been before the world taught her to hide. Stubborn, brilliant, desperately hopeful. One evening, as the candles burned low and the city hummed with life outside their broken sanctuary, Layla sat beside Shaq, her knees pulled up to her chest. You know they still think we're crazy, she said, her voice soft but laced with humor. Shaq smiled faintly. Let him think it. Crazy's just another word for brave. Layla laughed quietly, the sound rare and precious. You really believe he'll walk again? She asked, not looking at him. Shaq didn't hesitate. I believe in him, he said. And in you. For a long time, neither spoke. The room around them seemed to hum with something alive. Something that had nothing to do with science or medicine. Something older, deeper. Hope. The next breakthrough came 2 weeks later. It was raining that morning. A steady drumming against the sagging roof. Shaq almost canceled the session, worried about the damp and Malik's fragile health. But Layla insisted, said the storm outside, mirrored the storm inside. Malik, and sometimes you had to meet chaos with chaos. Shaq watched, heart in his throat, as Malik sat on the edge of the medical table, sitting upright under his own power for the first time since the accident. His legs dangled over the side, trembling but strong enough to hold their own weight. Layla knelt in front of him, her hands light on his knees. All right, champ, she said. Time to fight gravity. Malik swallowed hard, fear flickering across his face. You got this, Shaq said, stepping forward, his voice a steady rock in the storm. Malik closed his eyes, drew a deep shaky breath, and pushed. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then slowly, painstakingly, his right foot slid forward, planting itself flat against the floor. His left foot followed, weaker but determined. And then, with a cry torn from the depths of his soul, Malik stood. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't strong. His knees wobbled dangerously, and Shaq had to dart forward to catch him when he swayed. But he was standing. He was standing. Shawnee burst into tears, where she stood in the doorway, clutching her hands to her mouth. Layla wiped her face fiercely with the sleeve of her jacket, pretending not to cry. Malik beamed through the pain, the triumph radiant on his face. Shaq scooped him up, spinning him around in a careful, giddy circle. Laughter and sobs tangled together in his chest. "You did it, champ!" he shouted. "You're walking!" Malik laughed, breathless and joyous. "I'm walking." Shaq set him down carefully, letting him sit back on the table. Malik's legs trembled violently, exhausted by the effort, but his smile didn't fade. It was a moment so pure, so profound, that Shaq knew he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. Later, after Malik had fallen into an exhausted sleep, and Shawnee had taken him home, Shaq sat with Layla in the flickering candlelight once more. "You saved him," he said, voice thick. Layla shook her head, a small, tired smile on her lips. "No," she said. "He saved himself. I just showed him how." Shaq looked at her, really looked, and understood something deep and immutable. She wasn't just saving Malik. She was saving herself. And maybe, just maybe, she was saving him too. The body could break. The spirit could rise. And from the shattered pieces of their lives, they were building something unbreakable. Together, the heavy knock at the door came just after sunrise. 3 sharp blows that echoed through the crumbling building like gunshots. Shaq froze where he stood, halfway through helping Malik adjust his leg braces. Across the room, Layla stiffened, her body going rigid, her face drained of all color. She didn't need to say it. They had run out of time. Shaq crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling back the battered curtain just enough to glimpse the black SUVs parked across the cracked street. Men in suits milled around the vehicles, not cops but close enough. Child services, hospital lawyers, court officials, a small army come to take everything away. He let the curtain fall and turned back toward Malik and Layla. Malik's face was pale, but his jaw was set with the same fierce determination Shaq had seen the first time the boy had lifted his own foot. Layla stood beside him, hands balled into fists at her sides, her thin frame shaking not from fear but from fury. "They're here for him," Layla said, voice low and shaking. "They'll say you're unfit, that he's in danger. They'll drag him back to that hospital and they'll let him rot." Shaq swallowed hard, every instinct screaming to fight, to run, to shield his son from the cruel machinery waiting outside. But he knew better. Violence would only prove their enemies right. Anger would only give them more ammunition. Layla moved to the battered medical table, pulling out a worn leather pouch from beneath it. She laid it carefully on the surface, unrolling it with trembling hands. Inside were her tools, the strange, ancient-looking instruments she had guarded like sacred relics. "There's one last thing we can try," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "One last push." Shaq crossed to her side, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What is it?" he asked. She hesitated, her hands hovering over the tools, her whole body taut with some unbearable weight. "I wasn't honest with you," she said finally, "about why I know how to do this." Shaq frowned, sensing the ground shifting beneath him. "My mother," Layla's voice cracked, but she forced herself onward. "When I was a kid, after her accident, after they sent her home to die, she found someone, an old woman, a healer, not a doctor, not anyone official, just someone who knew things the hospitals didn't." She paused, staring down at the worn leather pouch. "She taught me, before she died, taught me how to listen to the body, how to move the energy that doctors can't see. She said it was a gift, one that could save lives if I was brave enough to use it." Shaq's throat tightened.
But you couldn't save her, he said gently.
Layla shook her head, tears streaming down her face now, unchecked. "I was too young. I didn't understand enough. I tried, but I failed. And she died. I promised myself I would never fail again." She looked up at Shaq then, her eyes blazing with a desperate burning light.
That's why I'm helping Malik. It's not charity. It's not a job. It's redemption. If I can save him, maybe I can finally forgive myself.
Shaq reached out, laying one massive hand gently on her trembling shoulder. You already saved him, he said. No matter what happens next. The knock came again, louder this time, accompanied by muffled shouting. Shaq turned to Malik, who sat wide-eyed on the edge of the table, his braces gleaming in the thin light. You ready, champ? Shaq asked. Malik nodded once, fiercely. Layla moved with a sudden frantic energy, arranging the instruments, lighting the candles with shaking hands. She pulled out a small vial, filled with a thick, golden liquid, and handed it to Shaq. Rub this into his legs, she ordered. Fast. It'll help. Shaq obeyed without question, working the warm, pungent oil into Malik's muscles, feeling them twitch and quiver beneath his touch. Outside, the shouting grew louder. Heavy footsteps pounded up the front steps. Layla knelt in front of Malik, her hands framing his face. Listen to me, she said urgently. You have to believe you can do this. Not hope, not wish. Know it. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are more. Malik nodded, his face set in fierce concentration. The door rattled violently. A voice bellowed, Mr. O'Neill, open up immediately, or we will enter by force. Shaq stood between the door and his son, his heart a wild drumbeat in his ears. Layla positioned herself behind Malik, her hands hovering just above his shoulders, her fingers moving in quick, intricate patterns. Now, she cried. Shaq stepped back, hands clenched into trembling fists. Malik closed his eyes, drew a deep, shuddering breath, and stood. Not with Shaq's help. Not with Layla's magic touch. On his own. He swayed, knees trembling, sweat pouring down his face, but he stood, taller than he had in months, his small frame defiant against the storm crashing at their door. The lock burst with a sharp crack, and the door slammed open, a flood of officials pouring in. But they stopped short at the sight before them. Malik standing tall, his braces gleaming, his eyes burning with fierce, undeniable life. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Malik took a step. It was small, shaky, awkward, but it was a step.
Then, another.
The officials gaped, mouths open, as Malik crossed the room on trembling legs, moving past them without fear, without apology. Shaq followed, every muscle tense, ready to defend his son, with nothing but the truth. Layla stayed behind, kneeling beside the battered table, her face buried in her hands, her body racked with silent sobs. Outside, the sun had broken free of the clouds, pouring golden light down onto the cracked pavement. Malik stepped into it, blinking against the brightness. Shaq knelt beside him, pulling him into a fierce, shaking embrace. You did it, champ, he whispered. You walked through fire, and you didn't burn. Malik clung to him, laughing through his tears. The officials milled around uselessly, murmuring into radios, unsure how to proceed in the face of a miracle they hadn't sanctioned, hadn't controlled. Shaq rose slowly, still cradling Malik.
You were gonna take him from me, he said, his voice low and dangerous. But you didn't believe in him. You didn't fight for him. She did.
He turned, pointing back at the broken doorway where Layla stood now, shoulders squared, chin lifted high. She's the reason he's walking, not you. The officials shifted uncomfortably, cowed by the truth they could no longer deny. Shaq ignored them, walking slowly toward the battered SUV waiting by the curb. Malik sat proudly in his arms, waving at Layla. She waved back, her smile small but shining like a new sun. The fight wasn't over. There would be hearings, investigations, endless questions from a system built to crush anyone who dared to defy it. But none of that mattered now. Malik had walked through fire, and they were all still standing, together. The world didn't change overnight. Even after Malik's steps shattered the narrative they had built around him. Helpless, broken, destined for pity. The system still tried to find ways to claw back control. There were meetings, interviews, guarded conversations cloaked in smiles and laced with suspicion. Hospitals issued statements about ongoing investigations. News anchors debated ethics from behind glossy desks. Some people cheered. Some sneered. Most just moved on, because miracles were uncomfortable things when they didn't fit into neat little boxes. But none of that mattered to Shaq, because every morning now, when he woke up, he heard the soft thud-thud of Malik's unsteady but growing footsteps across the hardwood floors. Each one was a small rebellion, a slap in the face to every person who had written him off. Shaq would lie there, eyes closed, counting each step like a blessing. He didn't care if the world doubted or debated. He had his proof, walking, laughing, living proof, and no headline could take that away. It was Malik's idea to go back to the place where it all began, the battered building with its cracked walls and crumbling foundation. Shaq hadn't set foot there since that day when the authorities had been forced to stand down, defeated by a boy's stubborn, staggering victory. Part of him wanted to leave it behind, let it fade into memory. But Malik insisted. "I want to say thank you," Malik said simply, his voice steady. So they went. The sun was high and hot when they pulled up, the truck rumbling to a halt in front of the familiar curb. Malik climbed down carefully, braces gleaming in the light, his steps still awkward but filled with purpose. Shaq stayed close but didn't hover. Malik needed to do this on his own. The building looked even more abandoned now. The authorities had shuttered it officially, boarded up the doors and windows, declared it unfit for occupancy. But the memory of what had been built inside those broken walls still lingered, stubborn as ever. And there, waiting at the foot of the steps, was Layla. She looked different now, older somehow, though barely any time had passed. Stronger, too. The sharp edges of survival were still there, but there was something softer now, something steadier. She wore clean jeans and a simple white t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a tight braid. She stood tall, unafraid, as if she had nothing left to hide. Malik made his way toward her slowly, each step careful, deliberate. When he reached her, he paused, looking up into her face with a wide, beaming smile. "Thank you," he said simply. Layla knelt, bringing herself eye level with him, her hand brushed against his shoulder, light and reverent, as if confirming he was real, not a dream. "You did the hard part," she said softly. "I just showed you the path." Shaq watched them from a few steps away, his chest tight with emotion. He had seen greatness on the basketball court, on the world's brightest stages, but nothing compared to the quiet heroism of this moment. A few reporters had caught wind of the meeting and circled like sharks on the sidewalk, snapping pictures, muttering into phones. Shaq ignored them. So did Layla. Malik didn't even notice them. But it wouldn't stay quiet for long. Layla stood and turned toward Shaq, her expression unreadable. "They'll never let me stay here," she said, her voice low but steady. "The city wants this place torn down, wants me gone." Shaq took a deep breath. "Then come with us," he said simply. Layla blinked, startled. "Your family now," Shaq said. "You saved my son, saved me. You don't owe these streets anything anymore." Layla shook her head slowly, her eyes shining. "It's not about owing," she said. "It's about finishing what I started." Shaq understood. She wasn't done fighting. She wasn't done healing. Some fires burned too hot to be contained by four walls and a quiet life. "You ever need a home?" Shaq said, stepping closer. "You'll have one. Always." Layla nodded once, fiercely. And then, because words were sometimes too small for moments like these, Shaq pulled her into a hug, one arm engulfing her thin frame, holding her tight. Malik joined in, his small arms wrapping around both of them. For a long moment, they stood there, a family forged not by blood, but by fire and faith. The cameras clicked and buzzed, but they barely heard them. Eventually Layla stepped back, her face composed once more. "There's something else you should know," she said, her voice softer now. "About me." Shaq raised an eyebrow, waiting. "My real name," Layla said, glancing down shyly. "It's not Layla." Shaq chuckled, not surprised in the slightest. "It's Amara," she said. "Amara Lucille Brooks. My mother named me after the word for grace." Shaq smiled, warmth flooding his chest. "It fits," he said. "Amara. A name like a prayer. A name that carried the weight of every step, every battle, every impossible dream they had dared to chase together." Later, back at home, Shaq sat on the porch with Malik and watched the sunset smear the sky with gold and crimson. Malik sat beside him, legs stretched out, his braces lying discarded on the steps. He was getting stronger every day, needing them less and less. "Dad?" Malik said after a while. "Yeah, champ. Do you think people like Amara ever get the credit they deserve?" Shaq thought about it, about the headlines that would never tell the real story, about the world that judged worth by titles and degrees, not by grit and heart, about the quiet miracles that went unnoticed every single day. "No," Shaq said honestly, "but that's not why people like her do what they do." Malik frowned thoughtfully. Why then? Shaq smiled, ruffling Malik's hair. Because they believe, he said. Because they know sometimes the sun rises even when nobody's watching. Malik leaned against his father's side, content. In the distance, beyond the fences and polished lawns, beyond the polished stages and camera lenses, a new day waited. It wouldn't be perfect. There would still be battles. Still be doubters. Still be scars. But there would also be steps. Slow, shaky, unstoppable. Footsteps into the sun. And this time they would not walk alone. Some stories don't end when the last page turns. They live in the choices we make every day. Stand for the unseen. Fight for the forgotten. Believe in the impossible. Because sometimes the smallest steps create the loudest echoes.